It's always a little unsettling getting a standing ovation before you said anything. It's generally downhill from there.
Your reputation precedes.
Yes, well, that's for sure. But thank you. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it, especially today, because I have had, and if you'll forgive this expletive, a morning from hell with a number of my friends, James Lindsay and Trevor Loudon and Brian Kennedy among them, imposed upon prodigiously to help me get a television show in the can, and it was not to be. It just didn't come together. In fact, it was kind of a clown show, to be honest with you. So this is definitely uphill from there, and hopefully not too far downhill from your standing ovation. I just want to say at the outset, Karen Sigeman deserves recognition for not just this particular program, which with her merry band she's put together at some remove from her home turf on the left coast, which is not an easy thing to do, as we've all discovered, but she does it magnificently and with, I think, a commitment to the cause that is really inspiring, and I hope you'll feel that in the course of the day, too. So I'm going to do two things, basically. I'm going to talk a little bit about why we're here, and maybe give you some titillating heads up as to what you're going to be hearing about from some of our really distinguished speakers. And then we're going to talk about two pieces of this that I think are particularly in need of your attention. And closing with one that I think you can do something about, which is what I think we all need more knowledge of. So I'm going to start by just introducing what I consider to be not so much World War III as World War Z. And in the course of my remarks, and I think probably most of our colleagues, you're going to find that there is this connective tissue that runs through the various problems, challenges, wars that we're now finding ourselves confronting. And that is Xi Jinping, the Chinese Communist Party's emperor, if you will, and a man who has, interestingly enough, known Joe Biden for a very long time. In fact, I think one of Hunter Biden's revelations, one of the less salacious ones, I have to say, just in case you were hoping for something more titillating, was that after an event, I can't remember whether it was a dinner or what, but Xi and his dad were hanging for hours beyond what was scheduled to be the time allotted. And he said something to the effect that as they parted, they embraced, and it was almost as though they were in love with one another. Think about that. Anyway, World War Z has been manifested, I would argue, by a phenomenon that is actually quite discernible. And that is when bad guys go to see Xi Jinping, nasty things seem to follow. Just to give you one example, Vladimir Putin went in February of 2022 to see Xi on the eve of what I call the genocide games, Xi called the Olympics. And shortly after Putin came back from Beijing, he invades Ukraine. Now, it didn't go quite according to plan, as you know. I think they expected it was going to be a splendid little war, and Xi was going to be among those who expected to benefit from it. It's been quite messy, but I think it's fair to say Xi has still benefited from it, among other things, getting access to immense amount of energy at bargain basement prices from a desperate Putin. Similarly, I think about a year later, Xi took meetings with members of the Iranian regime. And my friend David Wormser has just arrived. He'll be talking to you more about this particular story shortly. He also met with leaders, what passes for leaders of the Palestinian community, the Palestinian Authority. And within a couple of months, there was an invasion of Israel by Iran and its proxies. And again, I think it's pretty obvious that that was orchestrated with China. In fact, the Israelis have found a considerable amount of circumstantial evidence that the Chinese were all in on helping Hamas orchestrate this attack, helping it build its hundreds of miles of underground tunnel, arming it with modern advanced weapons, even training its leadership. So you have, not just, I think, a set of circumstances that seem to flow from one another. You have cause and effect, I believe. And so just to round this out, there are a couple of other people who've been visiting Beijing lately, which I think should give us pause. One of them is the president of Venezuela, Maduro. He got back and he actually said publicly he was going to invade his neighbor, Guyana. Now, he hasn't done it just yet, but people on the ground there think it is imminent. Maybe not the territory of Guyana, which is mostly jungle, but the maritime areas, which are rich with resources, notably oil and gas. And this is, I think, one of the things that will almost certainly light up our hemisphere. Then there's Putin's visit to North Korea, which was followed, as I recall, I may have the sequence backwards, but I think it was followed by his visit to Beijing. And we're hearing a lot of talk out of North Korea at the moment about war with South Korea, and maybe others. I mean, they keep firing missiles in the direction, in some cases, actually overflying Japan. So it could go there, too. And then, as I mentioned, there was this more recent visit between the partners in this no limits partnership, Putin and Xi, at approximately the time that Xi is acting increasingly aggressively against the Philippines and Taiwan and us. And one of the things that I just wanted to mention about the and us piece of this is that, and by the way, you'll be hearing more about this Pacific business with John Mills, who will be giving us a real threat briefing on what's happening there. We've got now, by some estimates, multiple divisions worth of People's Liberation Army personnel inside the United States. People who have been brought in here across that open border in the south to some extent, some to the north. And interestingly enough, you can't make some of this stuff up, folks, but it's stunning that one of the things that the Biden administration has done is streamline the admission of those people. Now, again, you don't have to be a trained intelligence person to recognize that if individual males are coming in unaccompanied, in some cases in groups of other unaccompanied fighting age men, and some of them are actually wearing tattoos that are associated with the Chinese special forces elements. And they're fit, and they're coming in apparently phased by the rigors of making the trek or through the Darien Gap in some places, in other cases being more conveniently flown into Mexico. But here they are coming in by the tens of thousands. And the Biden team, which had inherited in a regimen which said they are subjected to maybe 4 hours of interrogation, 40 different questions they had to go through about their background and associations and so on. That's been reduced to 5 questions, which you can memorize the answers to very easily and move right on through. And not only that, we very helpfully, as with most of these migrants, undocumented persons, move them around the country. Then there's the 300,000 or so students who are here from China, and untold numbers of businessmen and others. In other words, what we have is a cohort of people now here from China, all of whom are here with permission of the government, all of whom know it is their duty and their legal obligation under Chinese law to serve the motherland as called upon to do so. So what does that look like? I don't know, but I must tell you, I spend a lot of time thinking about it because it sounds to me as though that's a formula for disaster. And what if you take all of these things together, I think you come away being persuaded of, is there is a purpose to it all. I call it strategic arson. That Xi Jinping is deliberately setting, if you will, strategically located fires around the planet, which serve the purpose of both distracting us, diverting our resources, diverting our arsenal, diverting our energies to these other places, some of which we really, I think, have reason to care about. But more generally, it's destabilizing the planet in a way that redounds to the benefit of the Chinese Communist Party. And the trouble is that if the real target of Xi's own efforts is not just Taiwan, obviously seizing Taiwan is part of the game. He seeks to do that. It's trumping, if you will, Mao Zedong, who he admires, but he wants to excel, supersede. But we're the enemy. We're the main enemy. Then all of those dissipations of energy, resources, arsenal, and so on redound further to the benefit of China, which, as Karen said, has explicitly, overtly, repeatedly made clear is to replace us as the world's hegemon. So that's all kind of a problem. To come back to where we started, the point is it's not just the kinetic piece of this problem. It's that we've been subjected for decades. Most of us have no idea it's even happened, let alone the cumulative effect of it. But for decades, the Chinese Communist Party, long before Xi turned up, has been pursuing a program that, as Karen mentioned, is described as unrestricted warfare. By which they mean they use every technique you could possibly conceive of. And frankly, some that you probably wouldn't think of, to try to weaken us, demoralize us, sabotage us, and ultimately defeat us. And in the course of the day, you're going to hear more about all of this. James Lindsay, who is one of the greatest public intellectuals I've had the privilege of knowing, is going to talk to you, I think, about cultural Marxism and how this is a manifestation of that Chinese agenda. I mean, Mao Zedong sort of invented it, perfecting, some of the previous Stalinist techniques, but taking it into the realm of really taking down a culture, taking down a society. John Eastman, who has been introduced as a hero, and he is going to talk to you, I think, about the march through the institutions of our country. Notably, what's been done to the rule of law in America, which is as central to who we are and what this republic is about as anything. And you undermine confidence in that, and it's extremely corrosive for everything else. Trevor Loudon is going to be talking about the subject matter in which he is, I would argue, probably this country's, say nothing of New Zealand's, but probably also the world's preeminent authority, which is the phenomenon of the enemy within. And how it is that we are surrounded by them, it seems, certainly deeply penetrated by them, and what the implications are of that, and the Chinese emphasis on exacerbating that particular problem with what they call elite capture. So you're in for a very important conversation with him. I want to just turn to two things that I think require your attention especially. One is, as Karen mentioned, the fact that the sovereignty of our country is absolutely central to who we are, to the fact that we have the form of governance that she described so well, limited, accountable, representative, constitutional governance. And so if you're in the business of trying to take all that down, one of the techniques that you would employ, and the Chinese are getting away with doing, is something they call global governance. Global governance. Well, that's got a certain cachet to it, doesn't it? Because it's all one big world, after all, and so many problems in that world are much bigger than any given nation, and if we all just pull together, we'll do a better job of dealing with them, say, pandemics, or public health emergencies of international concern more generally, than any given nation can do. And that's especially true if, as the guy who runs the World Health Organization by the name of Tedros Ghebreyesus, a man plucked from the obscurity of a terrorist regime in Ethiopia, to run this more or less backwater of an international organization by the Chinese Communist Party, has his way, which is to say that the proper response to those public health emergencies of international concern is, and I'm not making this up, the China model. And don't take my word for it, folks. You might have lived through the application of the China model in the COVID-19 pandemic, where at Tedros's personal instigation, the United States, among other nations, abandoned the sensible practices for dealing with pandemics, particularly respiratory ones, by inserting instead, not the plan that we had on the books and that we have used heretofore and that works, but the Chinese model of mask mandates, of social distancing, of lockdowns, and quarantines, and mandatory jabs with inadequately tested vaccines, actually experimental gene therapies, that turned out to be more dangerous by far than the disease itself, especially if you happen to be a young person, or a military age young person especially. So I wanted to mention this to you because, as you may have heard, just about a month ago, something called the World Health Assembly, which is kind of like the UN General Assembly is to the UN. The World Health Assembly is this membership of all of the people who are part of the World Health Organization at the nation level. They met, and the good news was, I think in part because of the ruckus that we've been creating through some friends of ours, we call this Sovereignty Coalition. They didn't do the treaty that they really want to do, a pandemic treaty, they call it. But unbeknownst to most people, they did do another treaty, which it turns out amends so-called international health regulations and basically gives them the power, the authority that they wanted to get with that other treaty. So I just wanted to say this about that. There are a number of problems, just quickly to identify them. We can talk about them. We're going to do a Q&A session, I believe, in a little bit. So if you want to get into this in any more detail, we can do it, or see me after. But one provision of this treaty is you have to change the laws of the United States in order to create a position of something called the International Health Regulations focal point, a kind of czar for making sure that we comply with what the WHO says. Now, interestingly, that is absolutely at odds with the basis upon which we got into this thing in the first place, which was they weren't going to change our rules. It was just going to be advisory. Secondly, they violated their own rules to promote this thing, to push it forward. They were supposed to give us 4 months to study it and decide whether it made sense enough. 4 hours wasn't even given. They just rubber stamped it. Among the other pieces of it are a digital gulag, we call it. You will get a digital ID. Every man, woman, and child will have one, which facilitates control. That's another part of the China model. In fact, that's the piece of the China model that was missing last time. It's called the social credit system. But once you have that ID, that digital ID, you can get the rest of it. And it will be tyrannical, trust me. There's also a censorship feature to this. You're not going to be allowed to talk about, and not just you, but your doctor, things that are not consistent with the guidance of the World Health Organization. And this may sound a little like what the Biden administration did to us in the pandemic. And depending on who you talk to, and I'm waiting to hear what John has to say about this, the Supreme Court seemed to give a little running room for them to continue doing it in the decision yesterday. So when you get an international treaty saying you must have a censorship mechanism, that's probably not going to be conducive to freedom of speech, for example, or maybe any of our other freedoms, for that matter. So there's likely to be more sickness out of all of this because they're going to be investing in massively, by the way, kind of a blank check, really, in pandemics when there's an awful lot of other disease that kills an awful lot more people than do pandemics, at least so far. And there's this other piece, and I don't know if you caught this, but earlier this week, the Surgeon General of the United States declared that we have a gun violence crisis in our country. Well, that is music to the ears of Tedros Ghebreyesus because he's already declared that one of those public health emergencies of international concern is gun violence. So, just to connect the dots here, if we get, in fact, embroiled in this treaty, If we don't, in other words, reject it. One of the things that I guarantee you will find is that the Biden team or the Surgeon General and the World Health Organization will be conspiring to figure out how they can not only address gun violence jointly, but they can do it in a way that grabs your guns. So none of this is constitutional, folks. Obviously, you'll hear more about that from John. Let me just conclude by saying there is one thing that I think we could do that would be very important and very impactful. And I don't say that just because I think it'd be kind of cool. I'm saying it because we saw it work the last time a totalitarian communist regime sought to take down the United States of America. That would be the Soviet Union. I had the privilege of working for President Reagan when he went to the American people and sought a mandate to not simply persist in what was called détente, or appeasement, if you will. It's a fancy French word for appeasement, or even containment of the Soviet Union. He sought in 1980 their approval, our approval, of a rollback campaign. And a guy who was instrumental in helping him devise and execute that strategy is a very valued colleague of ours. We work with him very closely on our committee on the present danger of China. His name is Roger Robinson. And Roger's idea, which as the International Economic Affairs Senior Director on the Reagan National Security Council for 4 years, was to cut off the cash flow of the USSR. And wouldn't you know that when Reagan executed that strategy, along with some other things, I was involved in Star Wars and the like, it worked. And as Karen said, going back to the acme of strategy, as Sun Tzu put it, without firing a shot, the Soviet Union was taken down. So what Roger Robinson is doing right now, and I don't know if you caught it, if you haven't seen it, you might want to check it out. Fox Nation last Friday aired a 3-part special program hosted by Maria Bartiromo, in which she talked about the fact that we today are not only not cutting the cash flow of today's existential threat to freedom, that totalitarian communist regime of our time, but we're actually underwriting it. And when I say we, I mean probably you, as well as millions and millions of others of us who happen to be in pension funds, or happen to have mutual funds, or have exchange-traded funds, or index funds, or any other instrument, basically, that Wall Street can get from you, a good slice of which they are putting into communist China, quite possibly unbeknownst to you, certainly unbeknownst to most investors. And that's not just putting it into China, folks, that's putting it into the Chinese Communist Party. That's putting it in some cases, even into the People's Liberation Army. They are, in short, using our money to buy the rope we will sell them with which to hang us. It's kind of a further twist on Lenin's old model. Anyway, my point is this, and I'll conclude with it. This must stop. And if we take steps to stop it, not only, I think, are those investors likely to not lose their shirts, which will be coming, count on it, especially if the Chinese do go to war with us. But they will also, I think, quite possibly make it a lot harder for those guys to engage in the kind of unrestricted, to say nothing of the kinetic warfare they have in mind for us otherwise. So I'll conclude by simply saying, this is the reason we're here, is to help equip you and the people who will be watching this video and others like it in the days to come. This should be, this idea of cutting off the cash flow of the Chinese Communist Party should be a deciding voting issue in this election. And I'm prayerful that one of the things that will come out of this debate, whatever it looks like in the end, is the kind of thing that we talked about in this book, and I've got a couple of copies of it here if you want one. The indictment prosecuting the Chinese Communist Party and friends, including those guys on Wall Street, for crimes against America, China, and the world. And with your help, I think we can make a material difference in the kind of threat we currently face from the Chinese Communist Party. And I want to thank you for being here. God bless you all.